let me talk a little bit about, this is called, I call this the open stack. But this is another piece of the internet part. So there's a thing called a stack. Technical people will describe it, there's more layers, but just to simplify, the internet protocol, the way that we connect these computers together, it's an open protocol that's not patented. The process is not an intergovernmental agency like ITU. It's actually an ad hoc committee called IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force. Anyone can join. There are teenagers who participate. Most of it happens online and then face-to-face. And they have this rule called rough consensus running code, which basically means everyone discusses, and then you have to write some software. So it's the opposite. ITU, they try to anticipate every problem and make a huge report. These kids, they just kind of say, let's try this. And they make some code, and then the code evolves. It's much faster, much cheaper. Sometimes you fail, because when they made email, they didn't anticipate spam or security. And so it takes a while for this evolution to occur. But the idea is you start something small and you iterate. And this is how the internet protocol is basically run. The next layer, which is the World Wide Web, which I remember when, you remember too, when we got the web, I remember getting the browser and all the internet guys said, oh, we don't need the web. We can log into the university, get the paper, read the citation, go to the next university, read the paper. Why do you need this? Yes, yeah, we have all these ways, Veronica, Gopher. We don't need the web. The web made it a little bit easier and created a way for even more amateur people to participate in the content. And that open standard that Tim Berners-Lee created another explosion of innovation, created Wikipedia and eBay and Amazon, because it made something a little less friction. So this is all you could do without internet protocol. You could connect computers together, but you just had to hire a software engineer and buy networking software and buy a computer company that would connect it. So it would cost millions of dollars. You could do it, it just cost more money. In the same way, you could do everything with the World Wide Web by hand, cost a little more money, and it also created a barrier for amateurs. But the internet protocol, I mean, most of the kids who worked with me on setting up the first internet service provider, they're amateurs. Most of the people who created the first websites were amateurs. And these amateurs turned into venture startups, and they were funded, and they became professionals. So the other thing, this is the World Wide Web Consortium, which is, again, a nonprofit organization. It's not an intergovernmental body. They have no authority, except that everyone uses it. It's a bottom-up consensus process, well, mostly. And so Creative Commons is the organization that I'm running, and I think it's actually the next layer. So each layer removes some friction. Internet protocol removed friction in the network layer. World Wide Web removed friction in sort of connecting the content together. And the next layer of friction that we have once everyone's connected is that it's actually you need a lawyer every time you want to do anything. Because if one professor wants to share with another professor, to be legal, you actually have to hire a lawyer and do a contract. Before, the technical cost of sharing Stanford University courseware with MIT courseware, the technical cost was so high that the transaction, the legal fee, didn't seem like so much. Or when Rai wants to work with NHK, they used to fly to Cannes and drink champagne, and the lawyers used to charge $100,000. It didn't seem like a lot of money. But now, when you're trying to connect everything on the internet, and there's students, and there's small transactions, suddenly the legal cost of sharing becomes a huge percentage of the transaction. So each layer that we do, we're removing a cost, removing friction, but we find friction one layer above. So the next layer that we need to free is this legal transaction cost. And we're not saying get rid of copyright. Copyright's very important. We're saying how can we make copyright easier to use? How can we make copyright much more like the internet, an open protocol where everyone understands and is available? So that's what Creative Commons is trying to do. The other piece of the success story is open source. So if you think about Google, they ran on Linux. I think they use MySQL probably, but they probably use some open database. And we have Apache, which is the most popular web server. It's also open source. Open source, again, just like the open standards, is a key component of lowering this cost. Now, again, you may say this is, it's like communism or something like that, but we call it the commons. I think that many things are actually free. Italian language is free. It allows you to communicate, and it increases the total value of your culture. the way that we do financial transactions, you know, theory about economics. This is all important that we share this knowledge to create more work on top. And so my theory is that by creating open source software and creating open protocols, while some people's businesses are destroyed, you are able to build businesses on top that actually increase the overall economy. Lawrence Lessig, who I think might be coming soon, my favorite example from him is, in the United States, it used to be that you owned all of the rights to the air above your land. So the airlines used to have to negotiate with every landowner to fly over the land, right? And this is a huge friction for the airline industry, as you can imagine. So the American government said, okay, above this altitude, it's not yours anymore. So they took private property away from the citizens to enable a new industry, the airline industry. You know, and sometimes individuals have to give some sacrifice to allow a new industry to be created. And a lot of what open source and open standards do is it does take earnings away from Telecom Italia in one side, but you can generate it in another. That's the idea. But if you don't do this one, but you're only getting stuck here, of course, you're going to have a difficult time. And that's why I think you have to think about the ecosystem and what role that you play in it. And so I call this the sharing economy. But basically, there's a whole economy. There's two meanings for sharing economy. There's the people who actually benefit from the sharing that occurs, like open source. And then there are people who will actually benefit from creating this infrastructure around it. So the users of the sharing economy and people who provide the tools for the sharing economy. But this is a whole new industry that's emerging and growing quite a bit. So let me explain Creative Commons a little bit more. So Creative Commons, what we did was we said copyright is very difficult to use. So copyright law says, the Berne Convention says that you automatically have copyright to all of your work. So if you are a professor or a photographer, the law is that I have to ask you permission before I use your work. And on the internet, copying is anything. So viewing, so before we had internet, before we had computers, I could give you a book. I could read a book. This had nothing to do with copyright. Copyright was only when one publisher took the work of another publisher. But now with digital technology, every time you look at a book, every time you give a book, every time you cite a book has something to do with copyright that didn't have that before. So what we decided was that so Hollywood and many commercial interests, they said, they're fine. Your lawyers should call my lawyers if you ever want to use Mickey Mouse. So for Disney, that's fine. But most people don't want to have to hire a lawyer every time they want to share something. If I'm a photographer, I could say, okay, I don't mind as long as you give me credit. Most academics, that's the foundation of academia, I think, which is to use each other's work, but provide citation, right? So what we did was we said, okay, what are the 4 things that people care about? One is attribution. So we found that over 90% of people want attribution, which means if you use my work, say it came from me. Then we found that some people say, okay, if you reuse my work, we want you to share it back to me. So Wikipedia uses this license, which is basically, go ahead and use my stuff, but if you make a remix or edit it, you have to give it back to me as well. And some people have only non-commercial use. If you're going to make money on it, you have to talk to me. Actually, 2/3 of the people who use Creative Commons license select this restriction, non-commercial use only. And then the other one is no derivative works. So this is like documentary producers, some photographers, some musicians say, you can share it among yourself, but please don't modify it because I don't want to change the story. But basically we said, okay, you take these 4 questions and you create a way for people to express that visually, legally, and technically, and you cover actually a huge spectrum of everyone from professors trying to share their courseware to bloggers who want to be on TV and don't want to ask permission. In fact, the Japanese broadcaster during the inauguration of Obama wanted to use a photo from Obama. And since I had talked to the broadcaster and they knew Creative Commons, they could use a picture of Obama without asking permission by giving credit to the photographer. And so the White House was saved thousands of faxes saying, can we use this picture of President Obama? Yes, you can use this picture of President Obama. Because of course they would say yes, but legally they have to ask. So this is the kind of friction that we can reduce, because if you already know what you want to give up, what's the point of asking permission?